Howdy, y'all. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 40 today. We're going to be talking about Protestant theology, and particularly the development of Protestant theology in the latter part of the 18th century, and then primarily through the 19th century and into the 20th century. We'll begin by looking at some things about the 19th century. The 19th century posed great intellectual challenges for Christianity. Rather than reject modern ideas, many Protestants sought ways to interpret their faith in terms of the new frame of mind. So during this time period, there's going to be some developments scientifically, there are going to be some major developments philosophically, and even sociologically. So Christianity is going to have to respond to those things. It's going to have to decide how to make a response, and it's going to be a challenge. But there is going to be a response, and we'll see several of those with some of the theologies that developed during this period of time. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had reached most of Western Europe. Its impact extended to the whole of life, obviously. If you know even just a little bit about history, you know that much. There were mass movements of people seeking employment in industrial centers. The traditional extended family was weakened by these movements, and by the traditional extended family would have been the family beyond the nuclear family. So going to aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, and them being, if not in the same home, then very close proximity. That's going to go away as people move into these industrial areas. Obviously, it doesn't go completely away, but it becomes much less the norm. And the emphasis is now going to be on the nuclear family, the mom, dad, and kids. And that's going to be a major change. More people came to see their lives as their own private responsibility. As a result, individualism and preoccupation with self became a theme in philosophy and literature. We'll look more into that as we go. The Industrial Revolution also contributed to the idea of progress. Throughout most of history, people considered that old, tried, and true practices were better than most innovations. But now people were no longer looking to the past, but to the future. The possibilities seemed limitless. Though the Industrial Revolution had caused some problems, the leading classes of society believed applied technology would soon solve them. And that thinking really hasn't gone away. We still have it today. And of course, we live in a time in which technological advancements seemingly happen on a daily basis, not over a period of years, although there's certainly big jump ups can maybe take that long, but we see change constantly. And so the looking towards the future as being a better time, in some ways we do that. Of course, now we also have people, the doomsday people with climate change and that kind of thing, saying that we don't have much time left. So you've got that part too. But there's definitely this idea that came about at this time that progress, and especially technology and science and innovation, all those things would hold answers for the future. And I don't think that's completely gone away. In fact, I think that's pretty much embedded. Even Darwin's theory of evolution was an expression of the faith in progress. Not only humankind, but all of nature is progressing. So this theory of evolution was just another way of affirming this idea about progress, that we as a species, and actually all living things on Earth, all living organisms, had gone through a progression. So you started off as something very small and evolved over time from that into different forms, and eventually becoming what we see today. Continuing on, history was now looked at as the progress of the past. The 19th century became intensely aware of the radical changes that had taken place in society through the centuries. So history is looked as being a progression, and it's not going to be looked at as just looking towards the past, but there's actually movement forward, momentum towards something. And again, just ideas about history change, and that's going to change a lot of the way you look at the world. Thus, the conclusion was reached that humans had not always been as they are now, because their intellectual and religious views had evolved. And that's going to definitely play a big role in what people think about religious thought. It's not going to be just in the past. And you can't just take the original beliefs of Christianity and sit with those. They have to progress as well. They have to evolve as well. And that's going to cause a big issue. And we're still dealing with that issue in our current day. And in fact, it's a big issue, maybe even more than most people think. We'll get into some more of that later. The result was a series of historical studies that cast doubt on much of the traditional views of the past. These studies applied to Scripture and early Christianity produced results that many found incompatible with faith, and that's not a surprise, because if you go back into the history of Christianity and want to interpret it in such a way that the origins of it are not legitimate, you've got a serious issue, because now you are jettisoning the original teachings of Jesus Christ and his direct disciples in favor of modern thinking. And that's really not going to work very well in Christianity. And it hasn't worked very well. There have been a lot of issues as a result of that kind of thinking. And that kind of thinking might be even more prevalent today than it's ever been. And again, we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go through this, but these are kind of this time period is the beginnings of some of the issues that have now come into full bloom in our day and time, started back at this day and time. Yet during this time, many Christians sought to respond to the needs of particular groups. The Sunday school movement was an attempt to teach those who no longer had much connection with the traditional means of religious instruction. So, as the church has always done, they're going to also respond to the needs of society, and that's certainly the case during this period of time. The Salvation Army, the YMCA, and many similar movements sought to reach the urban masses and alleviate their misery. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but as these urban areas become bigger and bigger, attract people, you have a lot of people that are in extreme poverty. Things didn't quite work out for them the way that they thought, and they're living in squalor, and these groups come in to try to help them out. But the needs of society went far beyond what these charitable institutions could do. Many began considering the need for a radical change in the social order. So again, this is going to have a big impact on society. It's going to have a big impact on Western culture, but it's also going to impact religious theology and the Western church. Comte, considered one of the founders of modern sociology, proposed such a change, one that placed society in the hands of capitalists and merchants. Socialism became a common theme of those preoccupied with existing social conditions, including vast numbers of Christians. So people who were very concerned about those who were not being taken care of in society began to turn toward the idea of socialism. And again, the echoes of the past resonate into today. There's more talk about this probably than ever in Western society, and even countries that strongly rejected communism and socialism of the past have now even started, maybe not completely full-blown go in those directions, but certainly a larger percentage of government officials and the society itself has begun to embrace at least the thought of these ideas. And we've seen that in Western Europe, and we certainly are even seeing that in the United States of America. So again, when did all this kind of start? It wasn't just yesterday. You go back to the end of the 18th century and through the 19th century, that's going to make such a huge impact on the 20th century and beyond. Let's turn our attention now to a couple of big names that you'll recognize that definitely had a huge impact on the way people thought at the time. The socialist author who would eventually become most influential was Karl Marx. His Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. A basic element of his analysis of history and society was the notion that ideas, no matter how purely intellectual they might appear, have social and political functions. The dominant class develops an ideology that passes for a purely rational construct, but whose true function is to bolster the existing order. Religion itself is part of that structure of support for the powerful, hence the dictum that religion is the opiate of the people. You may have even heard that as the opiate of the masses. Same idea. So you probably know something about Karl Marx. He certainly is going to be the communist guy, socialist guy, and his impact is definitely felt today. And he's going to be a guy who thinks the need power structures that are in place are there to give the higher ends of society everything and keep the lower ends down. And he's not going to just stop with society in general or the political world. He also moves that to the religious world. And let's be honest, if we looked at the history of Christianity, that's actually not wrong. You think about from the time of Constantine on up until maybe even just around this time, or maybe a little before, the church was full of abuse, and largely the people in the higher echelons of the church did things that were very selfish and very much about bolstering their own power, both politically and within the church. We've seen that time and time and time again. Now, do I agree with his answer about how to fix that? No, I don't. But I certainly can't agree that the problem is real, and it doesn't just stop in society. It had infiltrated the church for the vast majority of its history at this point. It's not any surprise that that could be brought out. It's very easy to see it, and we've seen it again in the study time and time again. But Marx believed that as history moved on, its next step would be a vast revolution that would lead first to a dictatorship of the proletariat and eventually to a classless society in which even the state would be superfluous, the true communist society. So this kind of this utopian communist ideal that never really has come into fruition, and in fact has ended up being quite the opposite of this, was his dream. And his thinking was eventually society would progress to this. Now, I guess you could make the point, well, if you want to go along with Marx, we just hadn't got to that place yet. Yeah, there have been some places that have tried this, but as far as being in that actual utopia, that perfect society for communism to flourish, we haven't gotten there yet. My answer to that is, well, that's because we never will get there. You can't do that with sinful human beings. It's not going to happen. As good as your intentions may be, powerful people are going to try to take power, and they'll use any system that it takes to get it. It really doesn't matter. A human system is not going to bring about utopia on earth, but this is what the thinking of Marx was, what he would like to have seen. Though Marx's views would pose a serious challenge to Christians in the 20th century, during the 19th century they made little impact. And really Marx wasn't picked up on until later, after his life was over, and really began to be followed and make a huge impact. And that certainly would be the case in the church as well. So let's turn now to Sigmund Freud. Late in the 19th century, the work of Sigmund Freud posed new challenges. After many years of study, Freud became interested in the way the mind functions, especially at the subconscious level. After years of observation, he came to the conclusion that the psyche is moved not only by that which it consciously knows, but also by other factors that never emerge from the level of the subconscious. This is true of experiences and instincts that the mind suppresses due to social pressure or some other reason, but never destroys. So, again, you've heard of Sigmund Freud. You may know some about his work. This is very basic, very simple. If you're a Freud expert, I don't need to hear from you that there's a whole lot more to it. Obviously there is. But the basic idea of this, of motivations, of the way you do things being very much about your subconscious, maybe even as much or more than your actual conscious thinking, that's going to have ramifications for religious life as well. Because if you're being heavily influenced by the subconscious, then that's going to certainly spill over into your religious practice, and it's going to have something to say about that. So obviously the thinking of Freud, right, whether you agree with it or not, is going to be something that has to be answered by all levels of society, and certainly the church is no exception. This opened new horizons for psychology, but also for theology, which did not always know how to deal with Freud's insights. So again, Christians trying to figure out how to make a response and where they fit in with these ideas is going to be a theme throughout the 19th century. Though they lived in the 19th century, both Marx and Freud made their greatest impact in the 20th. But it was during the 19th century that such disciplines as sociology, economics, anthropology, and psychology were born. So these are things that we just take as second nature now. Many of you probably studied some of these areas in college or throughout your life in whatever pursuits you may have gone down. But they didn't always exist. I mean, the things being studied existed, but the study itself didn't exist. And so these are all developing during this time period. And again, that's a huge change from the past, and the church has to find relevance in that. And it was in the context of these developing disciplines that theologians had to do their work. So let's look now at some of these theologians. Since Kant's work put an end to the facile rationalism of the 18th century, what route could theology follow in dealing with questions such as the existence of God or life after death? We talked about Kant and his work and kind of torpedoing rationalism. And so it brought about some different thinking in Christians philosophically and also theologically. And we're going to see some of those today. There developed three possible ways to deal with such questions. The first option was to seek a locus for religion other than pure or speculative reason. Early in the 19th century, Friedrich Schleiermacher proposed a solution which did not base religion on reason, but be it pure or practical. So Schleiermacher is going to understand the issues that Kant brings up, and he wants to try to develop a system of religious thinking that is going to be able to deal outside of a basis of reason. And he certainly develops a system. Whether you like it or not, it may be different, but he developed it. He was born and raised in the home of a Reformed pastor who placed his son's education in the hands of the Moravians. We've talked about them. Schleiermacher went through a period of time as a young man in which the pervading rationalism of his time made it difficult for him to continue juggling several of the traditional doctrines of Christianity. So he's going to have some issues with the very orthodox theology of the past in Christianity and knowing how to deal with those in light of what he is learning about rationalism and beyond. He was helped out of this by Romanticism, which held that there was more to human beings than cold reason. In this, he was able to find his way out of the impasse and doubt in which rationalism had left him. So he's going to turn towards Romanticism to help him to justify his beliefs in Christianity and also to interpret them. And it's going to radically change his system, the way that Christianity had been interpreted before this. His first major work, Speeches on Religion for the Cultured Among Its Despisers, was an attempt to show to an audience steeped in Romanticism that religion must still occupy an important place in human life. His main argument was that religion is not a form of knowledge, nor is it a system of morality. Religion is grounded neither in pure nor in practical or moral reason, but rather in feeling. So get off of the reason, the logic, the mental part, the intellectual part, and get back to the feelings and how it makes you feel and how you respond to that. So taking a very different approach, but it kind of gets rid of all the problems with rationalism because you're not even really considering this stuff to need to be justified rationally. It doesn't even matter if it actually is true. It has to do with how you feel about it. And so again, this is a very different way of thinking about Christianity that becomes accepted in society in a Western culture, and certainly is a viewpoint taken up to this day, but a big departure. This initial work did not clarify the content of such feeling, but he undertook that task in his more mature work, The Christian Faith. There he shows that this is not a sentimental feeling, nor a passing emotion or a sudden experience, but is rather the profound awareness of the existence of the one on whom all existence depends. So Schleiermacher is not rejecting God, he's not rejecting belief in God, but he doesn't reject Christian theology, he just looks at it in a different way. And we'll see even more as we go through this what that means exactly. Such feeling is not an undefined or amorphous feeling. It is not based on rational faculties or on moral sentiment, but it does have significant consequences in both rational exposition and in ethical responsibility. So let's look at what that means. This feeling of dependence takes a specific form in each religious community. The purpose of religious bodies is to communicate to others and to future generations their particular constitutive experiences so that they may share in the same feeling. Schleiermacher would not reject other religions. He just was interested in Christianity. So he certainly would apply this thinking to any kind of religious belief. And it'd be just as valid, but he's going to be on particularly Protestant Christianity because that's what he had been. And so he's going to apply it to his own background, but he's certainly not going to say that any other religious community can't do the exact same thing. In fact, he would encourage them to. Schleiermacher himself is interested in the Protestant religious community, which is based on two fundamental historical moments: Jesus and the impact he made on his first disciples, and the Reformation of the 16th century. So Schleiermacher takes those two things and it kind of says those are the most important things about the Protestant faith. And those two historical moments, the life of Jesus, his impact on his followers, and then the Reformation of the 16th century. The function of theology is to explore and expound on the implications of that feeling of dependence at three levels: the self, its relations with the world, and its relations with God. Anything that cannot be related to the feeling of dependence has no place in theology. So again, very much about your emotions and your feeling, and kind of makes the idea about needing to be rational not important, because it doesn't really have to do with that. This is his system. For this reason, the traditional distinction between the natural and supernatural should be set aside, not because it opposes modern science, but rather because that distinction limits our feeling of dependence to those events or places in which the supernatural is made manifest. So again, Schleiermacher is just saying there doesn't need to be an issue with worrying about whether this is a supernatural event or is a natural world. All of the things that go along with that, trying to rationalize it, just take that out of the equation. You don't need it. It has to do with something else, and that's going to be what he continues to develop throughout his life. By thus insisting that religion is different from knowledge, Schleiermacher could interpret the central doctrines of Christianity in such a way that they did not contradict the findings of science. And it's easy to see why, because they didn't have to be in contradiction. Even any contradiction that may exist wouldn't matter, because it's not about that. It has to do with this feeling of dependence and everything that goes along with that part of it. So a very different way, again, of looking at it, but it makes it easy to kind of just go along with whatever society's doing, because it doesn't really make any difference. Schleiermacher's influence was great, but he had even more influence over later generations. He would appropriately come to be known as the father of liberalism. So Schleiermacher, for very many Christians, became the one to follow, the one that they loved more than any others, the systematic theology that he had. Personally, that's not my way. I don't go with this thought. I certainly am not going to be one who says throw out whether or not any of the truths of Christianity really happened, or any things we read in Scripture or whatever it may be. That's the opposite of the way I believe. So I'm not with Schleiermacher, but there's no question that he has been very influential. Well, let's look at one more today, and we're going to look at Hegel's system. Another route that remained open after Kant's critique was to agree with him that the mind stamps its seal on all knowledge, but then, instead of seeing this as a proof of the limits of reason, to affirm that reason is reality itself. You read that sentence, and to me, that started making my head hurt. A lot of this philosophical stuff, even some that kind of mixes theology and philosophy, just after a while, my eyes glaze over. So we're going to dig into this because this system is pretty complex, but I'll just warn you in advance. You may love this stuff and it may be fascinating to you, and that's awesome. For me personally, it's not as much, but it is important that we look at it because it has a great influence on the future of theological and religious thinking. Reason is not something that exists in our minds and which we then use to understand reality. Reason is reality, the only reality there is. So the rationalism deal, kind of, he gets around that by just saying that it's not just something that as human beings we're trying to figure out. It has to do with what reality is. And so he's going to develop that thought. This was the route followed by G.W.F. Hegel. He began his intellectual career in the field of theology, but later decided that theology was too narrow a field of inquiry, and kind of went into more of a broader-based philosophical type of thinking. Reality must not be seen as a disconnected series of things and events, but as a whole. He proposed that this could be achieved by affirming the identity of reason and reality. It is not simply a matter of reason being able to understand reality, it is rather that reason is reality, and that the only reality is reason. Again, this is a system that gets around some of the problems that have developed, or the thinking that Christians are having a difficulty dealing with. In speaking of reason, Hegel does not refer to mere understanding nor to the conclusions of reasoning, but to the process of thinking itself. In thinking, we pose an idea, examine it so as to surpass it or deny it in favor of another, and finally reach a third idea that includes whatever there was of value in the two previous ones. So this is kind of his system of reasoning things out. This process of posing a thesis, questioning it by means of an antithesis, and finally reaching a synthesis is what Hegel calls reason. So this was his big way of coming up with what reason is, and then that's reality type of deal. This is therefore a dynamic reason, a system that is constantly advancing. This reason, however, does not exist exclusively in the human mind. The universal reason, the spirit, as Hegel sometimes calls it, is the whole of reality. So let's look a little bit more about that to finish out today. On that basis, Hegel built an impressive system that included the entirety of history as the thought of the spirit. The various religions, philosophical systems, and social and political orders are moments in the spirit's thoughts. Okay, what does that mean exactly? In that thought, the past is never lost, but is always surpassed and included in a new synthesis. Thus, the present includes all the past, for it sums it up, and all the future, for the future is the rational development of the present. I'm going to have a hard time helping y'all with this because I don't understand this myself, but I'm just going to tell you what a system is. Hegel was convinced that Christianity was the absolute religion. This did not mean that Christianity denies other religions, but rather that it is their culmination. So I do get this. Hegel would not say that, for instance, Buddhism didn't have validity. He would just say the ideas of Buddhism aren't fully the theology of it, the way of thinking of Buddhism, the questions it asks. It wouldn't be answered within it. You have to come to Christianity because that is where you get the ultimate answers. And so, again, not rejecting other religions, making them or considering them to be valid, but just inadequate. And Christianity is the one that finally answers the big questions, and he's going to go through what those in his mind are. The central theme of religion is the relationship between God and humanity. The relationship reaches its apex in the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation. Likewise, the doctrine of the Trinity is the culmination of the idea of God. The dialectic of the Trinity includes three movements. So, again, very simply, every religion wants to know how God and human beings relate to one another. Well, in Christianity, you find a God who becomes a human being. In his mind, that's the ultimate. You can't get any closer than that because you got God actually incarnate. So in Christianity, you get the ultimate expression of that. And the same thing with the Trinity. Every other religion has a different idea of monotheism. There may be a lot of different gods. But in Christianity, you have the Trinity. It's one God, but it's three persons and everything that goes along with that. So in his mind, that's the ultimate expression of who God is. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this. First of all, God is the eternal idea in itself and by itself, even apart from the development of that rational reality that we call creation. This is the kingdom of the Father. Again, this is where my eyes start to glaze over. The kingdom of the Son is what we usually call creation. That is the world as it exists in time and space, and its culmination in God's incarnation. And that's not really that surprising because Scripture teaches us that Jesus is the agent of creation, and he also enters into the creation in a very real way by taking on flesh. So you can understand why he thought that about the kingdom of the Son. The kingdom of the Spirit follows the union of the divine and the human and is made manifest in the presence of God in the community. All this taken together is the kingdom of God. So these three kingdoms the members of the Trinity have, you put them all together, you get the kingdom of God, which comes to historical fruition in the moral life and in the order of the state. The result of this, as Hegel saw it, was a philosophy completely free of the narrowness of all dogmatic or partial systems. This far-reaching scheme of reality found many admirers. Even among many who did not accept it, Hegel's system forced philosophers and theologians to take history seriously. After Hegel, history would no longer be a secondary matter for those who were concerned with eternal realities, but would be seen rather as the locus in which eternal realities are known. So again, I can't help you with 100% of Hegel's system because I don't understand 100% of it myself, but there are things in there I think that are understandable. You don't have to be a theology major or philosophy major to get them. So we talked about a couple of very important theologians. Next week, we're going to finish this out by looking at one of the most important ones, and that's Kierkegaard. And then we're going to kind of look at some other things about Christianity and history. So we'll do all that next week. Thanks again for taking time with me today. Hope that you enjoyed this time, and also pray that you'll have a great rest of your week. Till we meet again next week, God bless.